Haigusio, Hafade, and Aloha mai kakou. Welcome to this virtual parallel discussion of the United Nations Human Rights Council 48th session from 13 September through 8 October in the year 2021 in Geneva, Switzerland. This event is titled U.S. Military Human Rights Abuses in the Pacific and is under the auspices of Incomendios, a non-governmental organization in consultative status with the Economic and Security Council of the United Nations. It is also co-sponsored by the Kiwani Foundation and the Peace For Okinawa Coalition. Additionally, we would like to thank our Commonwealth 670 and the Ryukyu Independence Action Network for your support. Our panel examines the harmful impact of U.S. militarism among Pacific Islanders and will be focusing on 3 indigenous island nations: Luchu, also known as Uchina or Okinawa, the Mariana Islands, consisting of Guam and the Northern Marianas, and the Hawaiian Islands. Everyone in today's panel presentation is indigenous to the Pacific. My name is Robert Kajiwara. I am native Luchuan, also known as Uchinanchu or Okinawan. I am founder and president of the Peace For Okinawa Coalition, a nonprofit organization based in Okinawa City with an extension office in Honolulu, Hawaii, dedicated to promoting indigenous Okinawan culture, history, language, and rights. I have a BA in history from University of Hawaii at Manoa, an MA in history from University of Nebraska at Kearney, and a Ph.D. A.B.D. in history from Manchester Metropolitan University. My petition to stop the illegal construction of the new military base at Henoko, Okinawa, has over 212,000 signatures on it. I will be moderating today's panel discussion. Next, I would like to introduce all of our panelists. We have Professor Hoshin Nakamura, Professor Emeritus in History from Okinawa University. Professor Nakamura is also native Luchuan or Okinawan and survived the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, in which at least 1 out of every 4 Okinawans were killed. Professor Nakamura has degrees in Asian Studies from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and Seton Hall University. He taught history at Okinawa University for over 20 years and has also taught at University of Maryland and University of the Ryukyus. Professor Nakamura has been an advocate for a restoration of Ryukyu's independence for over 5 decades. Professor Nakamura, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Next, we have H.E. Leon Kalahau-Siu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Hawaiian Kingdom. He is a prominent strategist, advocate, and spokesperson for Hawaii's independence. Minister Siu is a familiar participant in Geneva at the Human Rights Council and is working to restore or develop new relations between the Hawaiian Kingdom and other states. He is the chair of the Decolonization Alliance based in New York City, a co-author of the book Modus Vivendi, Situation of West Papua, and was nominated for the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Minister Siu, thank you for joining us today.
Aloha, good to be here.
Next, we have Madam Laulani Teal. She is a Hawaiian peace builder, activist, and musician from Windward, Oahu. She is the coordinator of Ho'opaepono Peace Project, an affiliate of 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples. She is trained in La'au Lapa'au, or traditional herbal medicine, Ho'oponopono, traditional peace process, and midwifery. She is also an artist, mother, and community health worker. She holds a master's degree in public health, specializing in community health development and addressing health issues related to colonization and activism. Madam Teal, thank you for joining us today. Next, we have Madam Monieka de Oro, an Indigenous Chamorro mother, peace activist, educator, and community organizer based in the Mariana Islands. She is a Just Transition Curriculum and Policy Fellow with Climate Justice Alliance, coordinating community-based solutions with member organization Micronesia Climate Change Alliance. She is deeply involved in efforts uplifting the experiences of Pacific Islanders on the front lines of the climate crisis. Madame De Oro received a BA in anthropology in 2011 and a Micronesian Studies graduate program certificate in 2019, both from the University of Guam. She has wide professional and volunteer experiences in social justice, historic preservation, environmental protection, and cultural perpetuation. Madame De Oro is on the board of directors for the Guam Environmental Protection Agency, was selected by the U.S. State Department as a Young Pacific Leader in 2019, and is an alumnus of the Sierra's Club Women Earth Alliance 2020 Accelerator Program. Madame De Oro, thank you for joining us today. To begin our panel discussion, we would like to first turn to the Luchu Islands, also known as Okinawa. We would like to ask Professor Nakamura to please share about the background, the history, and the current experiences of Luchuans or Okinawans dealing with the U.S. military. Professor Nakamura, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm happy to join this meeting, Zoom meeting, and discuss with the brothers and sisters of Pacific Islands. I am an indigenous Ryukyuan, Hoshin Nakamura. I'm one of the rare survivors of the bloody Battle of Okinawa in 1945. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to report on the U.S. military human rights violations in the Pacific today from Okinawan point of view. This is the geographical location of the Ryukyu Islands that consists of about 215, including uninhabited islands. Ryukyu Islands are located between southern Japan, Kyushu, and Taiwan. So this chain of islands consists of the Ryukyus. The main islands are Amami, Okinawa, Miyako, and Aoyama group. As you notice, this in parentheses it says Japan, Ryukyu Islands, Japan, which means used to be independent nation. Japan took over the islands and colonized. No other prefectures has this kind of sign. So today, the Okinawa prefecture under Japanese control after 1879 consists of Okinawa Island Group, Miyako Island Group, and Aoyama Island Group. That is altogether 160 islands, including uninhabited islands. Brief background of the Ryukyu Islands. The people of Ryukyu Kingdom maintained a very peaceful and friendly relationship with the neighboring nations from prehistoric age to the early 17th century. They confidently used the power to self-determination to operate independent kingdom where they had enjoyed prosperity, peace, and longevity until the early 1600s. However, the Ryukyu Kingdom encountered a series of disasters brought by the outside invaders in 1609, 1879, and 1945, respectively. This is a map and route or timeline that shows Satsuma invasion. This southern tip of Japan is called Satsuma. They sent 4,000 invaders, 1609. This is very illegal. No independent nation should be attacked by other independent nations. The Ryukyu Kingdom had no intention to fight against Japan. They always maintained, the kingdom always maintained peaceful, harmonious, friendly relationship with all the neighboring nations. The 4 centuries of foreign control occurred because of after Satsuma invasion. Over 410 years, the indigenous Ryukyuans had suffered from autocratic and inhumane control of the outside powers. The power to self-determination and human rights have been taken away from the indigenous people. In 1879, Japan hijacked Ryukyu Kingdom and kidnapped King Shotai and his family, his government officials, who had been illegally abducted to Japan in spite of their strong opposition and resistance. This picture shows a Shuri Castle with King Shotai in it, pictured by French photographer in 1877. This is a ship called Tokai Maru that kidnapped King Shotai in 1879. Immediately after Kingdom was destroyed by Japan, the Japanese government built Okinawa Prefecture government for political control from 1879 until 1945. This building was destroyed in the Battle of Okinawa. After Japan's takeover, Okinawa prison were made throughout Okinawa Islands, Ryukyu Islands. Hundreds of Ryukyans were hunted, imprisoned, tortured, and killed herein by Japanese after 1879. Whoever opposed against Japanese, whoever claimed the independence of the Ryukyu, they were hunted and imprisoned, tortured, and killed. Okay, after that, Japan's assimilation policy took place. Japanese used all means to Japanize the indigenous Ryukyuans by destroying our languages, history, culture, religion, identity, and the like. Divine Emperor of Japan replaced the king. People were taught to worship and die for the emperor in Japan. The native Ryukyuans were brainwashed, mind-controlled, and hypnotized as Japanese citizens by means of Japanese assimilation program at all situations. Number 4, suppression and violation of human rights. After the total defeat of Japan in 1945, the U.S. military forces should have allowed the Ryukyuan people to become independent, just like the neighboring nations restored their independence. Instead, the U.S. forces stayed and confiscated large areas of islands and constructed huge military bases. As a result, the Ryukyuan people have been suffering from poverty and human rights violations under the U.S. military control to date. This is a photo which shows American poisonous water, toxic water called containing PFOS and P4, which is polluting Okinawan soils, rivers, and seas. Ginoan citizens' blood contained high level of PF hexes and PFOS. PF hexes 53 times higher than Japan's average. PFOS 4 times higher than Japan's average. And Nanjo City, that is where the southern tip of Okinawa, contains 12.5 times higher than Japan's average in PF hexes. This proves the Okinawan people have been drinking poisonous water for many years without being informed. The Okinawa Times newspaper issued on September 9 this month, page 2 says, Ginoan City Assembly unanimously agreed to protest against the U.S. military disposal of toxic PFOS and P4 and PFOS solutions into the ditch without the permission of the local citizens. All the peoples of the Ryukyus are very angry at the irresponsible behavior of the U.S. military forces in the Ryukyus. This picture also in the newspaper. Over 130 Okinawans protested against the U.S. that had dumped 64,000 liters of perfluorinated chemical compounds into the ditch that had contained toxic PFOS and P4 at Camp Zukeran, Kitanakagusu's central part of Okinawa. 5. Remilitarization of the Ryukyu Islands. still going on now by both Japanese and Japanese defense forces and American military bases under construction in Henoko, from northern islands to southern tip of the end of the island called the Yonaguni Islands. So all entire islands are being militarized heavily. And in Henoko, this is the coral reefs. Despite the Ryukyu's strong protest, the Japanese government has removed and transplanted the massive coral reefs of Henoko Sea to construct a new U.S. military base. Japanese and the U.S. government have been destroying the Ryukyuan coral reefs and construct a new military base in Henoko, northeast of Okinawa. The ancient Ryukyuan people believed there had been a Ryugu, or the dragon palace, under the colorful coral sea. 6. The noise. Next is noise damage. The Ryukyuan people have also been suffering from the noise damage caused by the roaring sounds of the U.S. military planes flying over the houses, schools, and hospitals very early in the morning and late at night. All these are not allowed in the USA, but both the U.S. and Japan have been ignoring our protest. Former Governor Ota Masahide said both Japan and America are double standard and they are NIMBY. NIMBY means anything bad should not be not in my backyard. That is, he said, NIMBY. The regulation standards for noise and specific factories and specific operations based on Japanese noise regulation laws and ordinances states that time zone is specified from 6 in the morning and 10 at night. The noise is limited from 40 decibel to 70 decibel. Between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Is the time zone for the most people to take a rest from the day's work. However, the U.S. military planes are freely flying over the residential areas early in the morning and late at night in the Ryukyu, disregarding the Ryukyuan people, Japanese law in many years. Okinawans are suffering from noise damage because of that. Local government inspection team recorded that there were 60 U.S. military plane flights over from Kadena Air Base between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. in one day, making a loud noise at 123.9 decibels. That was 177% noisier than Japan's noise regulation. At least 10 Okinawans living around the Kadena Air Base alone are reported to have been dying from the noise damage every year, while many others are suffering from it. No more human rights violations anywhere in the Pacific. The Ryukyuan people have suffered too much and too long under the foreign control. The human rights of the indigenous Ryukyuans have been violated and ignored for more than 410 years now. Now is the time for the oppressed Ryukyuans, the native Hawaiians, and the peoples of the Marianas and Guam to become independent and free from the outside control. Conclusion. The U.S. military occupation in the Ryukyu Islands has brought about the following side effects. Number 1, unending rapes of the local women since 1945. At least 6,000 rapes, many murders occurred. Number 2, the murder of the local people by the U.S. soldiers took place or may happen again in the future. 3, chronic economic poverty of the islanders. Out of 47 prefectures of Japan, Okinawa is always the poorest state, lowest income. Number 4, military base generated crimes and accidents are ongoing. Number 5, polluting rivers, seawaters, drinking water, and so on. 6, deadly noise damage by the military planes. 7. Destruction of democracy, violation of the local people's human rights and their happiness. 8. Target of attack by the enemy nations. As a result, human rights, peace, and democracy of the indigenous Ryukyans have been endangered. So, immediately would like to stop these side effects of U.S. military occupation. And in the long run, we'd like to see Okinawa, Ryukyu Islands, to become independent, to restore independence, to regain the power and the right to self-determination, which is completely taken away from us today. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and love for the lost, peace for the world.
Thank you, Professor Nakamura. Next, we would like to turn our attention to the Hawaiian Islands, and for that, we turn to Minister Siu to give us some background information and history of Hawaii. Minister Siu, the floor is yours.
Okay, mahalo, mahalo nui, aloha ke akua. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you to Incomindios for inviting us to participate in this side event, as well as the Human Rights Council. And we just really hope that those in the Human Rights Council will take heed to our messages here on this panel discussion. What Dr. Nakamura outlined is very, very similar to what happened in Hawaii. You know, a private kingdom overtaken by a foreign nation, illegally invaded and then occupied and then subjugated and exploited for the benefit of the occupation forces. So what he described is very similar. And the shocking thing here in Hawaii is that, and as well as in Okinawa, is that much of this has gone unheeded and unresponded to by the global community. So I just want to give just a brief outline about what happened here in Hawaii. As we mentioned earlier, Hawaii was an independent country enjoying prosperity as well as discourse and conversations and trade with the rest of the world. We were one of the countries that had the most extensive trade relations in the world at the time, with over 130 consulates and embassies around the world. We were very active in the discourse among nations regarding issues of slavery and issues of war and issues of neutrality, as well as equal recognition of sovereignties among states. So this is so the Hawaiian Kingdom was not a laid-back and backward nation, as is often portrayed by the United States and by detractors of our nation. The Hawaiian Kingdom was a very enlightened, very progressive nation, which the United States took over in 1890. Well, actually, they effected a turnover in 1893, which was a coup d'etat by a group of insurrectionists, white insurrectionists living in Hawaii, who decided they would take over the government in order to benefit their own pockets and to make more money for their sugar plantations and other businesses that they had in Hawaii. The United States was complicit in that because they landed troops, for one thing, to help to intimidate the Queen into not surrendering, but into yielding to the United States, which she did, but under protest. But what the United States motive in doing so was that they really coveted Pearl Harbor and the prospect of Pearl Harbor becoming a military naval base for the expansion or the projected expansion of the United States into the Pacific Islands and into the Western Pacific, to Asia. So Hawaii was crucial to them as a military base. And interestingly enough, that is still the primary reason that Hawaii is being held by the United States. So even though over all of these years we have complained about human rights violations, we've complained about the incursion, the political incursion into Hawaii by the United States, the brainwashing and indoctrination that occurred, the assimilation of our people into the United States. All of this was done really for the purpose of the United States maintaining its military presence and bases in the Hawaiian Islands. It is very critical to the United States to do so, which is why it is so difficult to talk about human rights violations and everything else, because whatever we bring up, the United States insists that they are there lawfully or legally, and that they are, and that they basically won't budge from the position that Hawaii is part of the United States. And the motive for doing that is that they need the Hawaiian Islands for their military bases. The largest command in the world, the Indo-Pacific Command, is located in Honolulu. Their command, which is the United States Military Command, stretches over half of the planet, the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. And this is the huge, huge military command. And that is crucial to the United States interests. But of course, it puts Hawaiians into a very dangerous and precarious and jeopardized situation, because the military bases in Hawaii and the Pacific Command are obviously prime targets for any enemies of the United States. So one of the things that the United States claims is that if they were not in Hawaii, then other nations would come and take us over, presumably nations that we don't want to take over. That is completely unsupportable as far as our experience in the past. No nation has tried to take over. Well, a few have, Great Britain and France, but they were quickly expelled, and they were expelled not only by the Hawaiians, but because of the intervention by the international community to keep Hawaii a neutral place. So, when the United States says that they are there for our protection, that is totally incorrect or totally false, because they are really there to protect their own interests and their interests in military expansion into the Pacific, or military dominance around the world, actually. So our situation is grave indeed, because Hawaii actually has no enemies, but the United States has a lot of them. And the United States has some very powerful enemies. And what that does is their military bases in Hawaii puts us Hawaiians in grave danger, in imminent attack and annihilation, because the method of warfare has changed greatly. Back in 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, that was an attack that the United States claimed, okay, it was an attack on Hawaii. It was not an attack on Hawaii. It was an attack on Pearl Harbor and the other military bases in Hawaii, because it was crucial for Japan to destroy the United States' ability to conduct warfare, particularly naval warfare in the Pacific. If Japan wanted to continue its expansion, it had to take out the United States base at Pearl Harbor. And so that's what the whole objective was. It was not to attack Hawaiians, to somehow take over our sandy beaches and our wonderful climate and our people of aloha. They attacked because the U.S. military was there, and it was a must-do strategic move on their part to neutralize or to take out the United States military forces there. So now we are projected 70 years later into the future, into the 21st century, and we are still under the control of the United States because of their military bases. Only now the method of warfare has increased dramatically. And now, instead of dive bombers dropping conventional bombs on Pearl Harbor and just a few civilians becoming threatened by that or being injured by that, now the weapons are far more deadly and far more expansive and far more deliverable than they used to be in the past. And so we're talking about now nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles, or even hypersonic missiles dropped from space. So we have really no chance in Hawaii of repelling any kind of attack. This puts the entire population of at least the island of Oahu at immediate risk of annihilation, because one of those nuclear weapons coming through is 100 times, at least 100 times more powerful than the nuclear weapon that was used over Hiroshima. And so to have something like that dropped on the island of Oahu would basically annihilate the island of the people of Oahu and completely destroy whatever is on that this island. So, but we're not talking about just one nuclear weapon, because these come in multiples now. So we're talking about a method of warfare where one strike takes out not only the military bases, but everything else around it, an entire island. And then, of course, the fallout and the residual things from any kind of nuclear attack would then destroy the rest of the islands as well. So the Hawaiian Islands are at grave risk for one reason, because the military is in Hawaii, the U.S. military. It's there for its own selfish purposes and for its own interests and its own goals. So the human rights violation here is putting an entire population, not just Hawaiians, but all the residents in Hawaii, under grave danger and under threat of nuclear annihilation by the United States. So this is why the urgency to not just talk about, but to affect a disarmament or denuclearization or demilitarization, all of these things of the Pacific, because it is not only the Hawaiian Islands that are threatened like this, Okinawa, the Northern Marianas, Micronesia, many, many other nations in which the United States has installed military installations are all targets for any country that has the capability of attacking the United States. So mahalo nui loa. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Minister Siu. Madam Lalani Teal, would you like to add anything regarding Hawaii or specifically U.S. militarism in Hawaii?
Yeah, for sure. To just kind of pick up where Minister Siu left off and to continue this forward, I think that it's very important for everyone to understand that we have come to the point in history where our history and our independence and our well-being really cannot be separated from the history, the independence, and the well-being of everyone in Moananui, the Pacific in particular, and it really, in a broader sense, in the world. And I think that is a very, very important thing to keep in mind. And meanwhile, as Leon said, we are a target for war. You know, where I am right now, I'm in Kahalu'u on Windward Oahu. You know, if I look straight ahead, there's a military base in front of me. If I were to be able to go through the mountain behind me, Camp Smith, which is where the command center is for the Indo-Pacific region, is right there, you know. And if you keep going, you know, along the H3 freeway, you would reach Pearl Harbor, you know, Pu'uloa, otherwise, which has become known as Pearl Harbor. You know, and it's really, really important to understand that these places are the launching point for the wars of the world, not only in the Pacific. And in the Pacific, it's very, very serious. You know, the United States military's stated overt plan over the next 10 years is what they call the Pacific Pivot. And they're looking to fully militarize the entire Pacific region. And they mean business here, you know. However, that doesn't mean that they're not going to have their hands all over the place and that we're not going to be used for invasion, because we are the launching point for invasions of everywhere in the world, even when they're on the other side of the world. You know, the Persian Gulf War in 1990, you know, was literally like, if I were to drop a nail straight down and it were to go through the earth, it would pretty much come out there. It's on the other side of the world, you know. And yet in 1990, a Marine named Jeff Patterson was the first protester against the Gulf War, because they were launching in the middle of the night from Kaneohe Marine Corps Air Station right there, and and he sat down on the tarmac and refused to go, you know. And otherwise we would never have known about it at all. But we found out because of his protest, you know. But the fact is that these happen every day. These you know, launching of wars and aggression all over the world. And we as humanity are at the place where if we don't stop this, and I mean we in the very, very big sense, if we do not stop this, it's not only about our human rights anymore. It's about the human rights of every single person that inhabits this earth, because this earth will not be livable if we don't turn this around. And I cannot say enough that it is the indigenous peoples of every single place who are protecting that place, and by doing so have the bigger picture of the survival of all of our future generations on a global sense in mind. So the key to protecting human rights anywhere, everywhere, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in, you know, in the rest of the Pacific, anywhere, it comes down to our ability to be free here where we are militarized. In Uchina, you know, in Guam, in Hawaii, all these places where the United States military is doing these terrible things to us and to the world at the same time. It is no accident that we have the strongest keys for peace in this world. And so, you know, what I would say to the United Nations Human Rights Council is that what we really need to do is look broadly at not only indigenous issues as a matter of, oh, here, let's give them some land. Oh, here, let's no, don't destroy that mountain. You know, I mean, yeah, don't destroy the mountain, but it's a lot more than that. It's about our liberation so that we can help liberate everybody else. And I say that very, very sincerely, that there is no one else who is capable of doing it. honestly, it is the people who are indigenous to these places who hold the key to pono. It's what we call pono, the state in which things are actually in balance. And that means that you can't be causing imbalance somewhere else just so you can create pono over here. Pono doesn't work like that. Pono works in a way that makes things right everywhere. And all of us as indigenous peoples, we have that concept deep within us. You know, if you look at the Uchinanchu struggles against military base, they're absolutely beautiful. I mean, you see kuponas, old people sitting in the roadway in the hundreds, you know, and you know, if you look at the people standing up against climate change throughout the Pacific, they're beautiful, you know? And these are the indigenous peoples, just like the indigenous peoples are standing against the pipelines on the continental United States or continental Mokuhonu, Turtle Island. It's, you know, these indigenous resistance movements are the key to healing the cancer that is about to kill everybody. And if there is not a determination somewhere, and I'm going to say that the United Nations Human Rights Council would be a great place to start, because if it's not you folks, who is it going to be? Who is going to start recognizing us and what needs to happen in the future for all of humanity through protecting our human rights to be free, so that we can do what we need to do to make things right.
Thank you, Madam Gio. Next, we would like to turn our focus to the Mariana Islands and to Madam Muñeca de Oro.
Hafide, Tiro, everybody. Guahusi Muñeca de Oro, Guinenias, Las Marianas, the Antilui Pacificu. I'm so honored to be here, and I don't even know if I have the words to follow up with what was just said and all the wisdom that was shared, especially around ensuring the uplifting of Indigenous people in this time, and Indigenous wisdom in this time is something that we can all hold to and true and heal and use for healing for this planet in this really difficult and dire time with the climate crisis and with the pandemic. Indigenous wisdom is definitely powerful and necessary as we move forward. And I wanted to share, before getting into my little presentation, I wanted to share just a little chant from my people as a way to offer prayer and honor to my ancestors and everyone else's, and ensuring that we move forward as one. And this is called Unuhit. It's one that my organization likes to share a lot, and it's the reminder that all things and all people are interconnected. And when we remember that sacred truth, we act in a way that's more harmonious, we act in a way that's more regenerative, and we act in a way that our future descendants will benefit from. Unuhit Zanitanu Itasi Atau Zanilangit. We are one with the earth, with the sky, with the sun, with the sea. We are one. Unuhit. And I hope that grounds everyone who listens to this presentation and who's heard all the stories from Okinawa and to Hawaii as a great reminder that our peoples across the world are one with this planet, and this is the only planet that we have, and we need to be doing all that we can to ensure that it's viable for future generations. And listening to all these presentations, I feel hopeful, because these voices that you've been hearing from are voices of people who really truly care and hold this value system that's very similar to mine close, and are doing all that we can to resist really powerful forces that have harmed our peoples and have harmed our lands for far too long. And it's of utmost importance that we do what we can to support the Indigenous peoples in their fights to demilitarize, decarbonize, and decolonize their lands and their waters. So I'm from the Mariana Islands, which consist of both Guam or Guahan, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. And as you can see, Guam is pretty much positioned as a place that's really between the US and Asia, and it has always been propped by the US military as the tip of the spear, or a place where they could launch attacks. And having all this military presence in my home island of Guahan has made us a target. In 2017, we had a big reality check when North Korea named us as a target for their missile launches. The US presence is supposed to make us feel safe here in the Marianas. For many of us, it just increases the target on our backs. And not only that, the military presence has contaminated our soils, has contaminated our waters, and in many ways contaminated the psyches of most of the people that live here because of colonization and all that it brings. So the Mariana Islands was one of the very first islands in the Pacific to be colonized. We first made contact with European conquistadors 500 years ago in 1521 when Magellan landed on the shores of Guam. And for 300 years, we experienced the wrath of European colonization and genocide. And it wasn't until 1898 that the US took control of Guam specifically at the end of the Spanish-American War, and the other islands of the Marianas from Saipan all the way up to Ferran de Pájaros or Uracas, which is the 14 islands of the CNMI, went into control of Germany. And then after the fall of World War II, Japan took over most of the Pacific, most of Micronesia, and Guam was the only US territory to be controlled by the Americans. And at the start of the American presence in World War II, Guam was taken on the same day that the Pearl Harbor was bombed in Hawaii. Just the forces that were in the Northern Mariana Islands came down to Guam and pursued a 36-month occupation of Guam. And that ended with liberation in 1944, 1945. And then the US actually used our islands from Guam to Tinian to launch the first atomic bombs used in war, the Enola Gay and Fat Boy, which devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So our lands and our waters have always been used between superpowers, have always been used for war. And for the 4,000-year history that Chamorro people have been here, it's been the story of resistance and peace is so much longer than that. And those prehistoric ancestral ties are something that I think are really important to hold on to in these times and to remember and to carry forth. So the U.S. impacts on Pacific Islands are pretty much the same. We've been highly militarized. War has been a big part of the interest in our lands. And not only is it just in the Marianas, but we've also seen it in the Marshall Islands. And now there's more talks of U.S. militarization spreading to the other islands in the Federated States of Micronesia, as well as in Palau. So this idea of militarization is a monster that continues to grow and grow and grow and contaminate the places that they exist in. And it also comes with a lot of American mentality and diet, which has made us sick and also dependent on American economic assistance. The U.S. military has done a number of ecological damages One of the most pressing ones is on Guam, in which, as a result of military action, there's been invasive species that have been introduced here. The most prevalent one being the brown tree snake, which basically decimated our native birds. So we don't have bird songs here very much anymore. And 9 birds became extirpated and extinct on Guam alone since the 1950s. We've also seen a loss of reptiles and a real big disruption in the ecosystems and the health of the ecosystems, like limestone forest here on Guam. And then, of course, all of that military action from World War II and all of the construction of different bases all around the island has led to contamination of our water sources, contamination of our soils. And we have over 99 toxic sites related to the U.S. military on our small island of Guam, which is only 212 square miles. And this has resulted in high rates of cancer, high rates, and also just the American culture has really also inhibited our health. And we have high rates of non-communicable diseases. And another impact of health that's more recent is with COVID-19. Guam has become a safe haven for different ships. And every time a ship has come in, most recently just in late July, we've had an uptick of cases. Right now, we're in the midst of a surge of COVID-19 cases that really just started with a uptick of the cases in the military when there was different trainings happening with other forces from the United Kingdom to Australia and other places that were coming and converging on Guam to practice their war trainings. And these were a lot of young soldiers and sailors, and they weren't masking. They weren't really caring about the health of our community. And since basically the end of July, we've had almost 2,000 cases of COVID-19 and just 6 more deaths in the last week here from COVID-19 complications. And that's directly contributed to the U.S. military presence here. I just wanted to discuss a little bit about the scale of U.S. militarism around the world. Basically, the United States has 800 bases internationally, and all other countries combined only have 70 bases outside of their territories. And if climate change is something that really matters to you, like it does to me as a climate justice advocate, really holding the United States accountable to the amount of emissions and carbon emissions that they emit in the world and the amount of pollution that they have in the world is so important. The U.S. military alone is the single largest producer of carbon, of CO2, and the single largest consumer of the fossil fuel industry. And it also is the biggest protector of the fossil fuel industry. It's really important for climate action to hold the U.S. military accountable to their missions. And right now, according to the Paris Accord, there is the U.S. military and all militaries don't have any restrictions on their carbon emissions. And this is major in the fight to protect our world from the changing climate. If we can't hold the U.S. military accountable, what are we really doing to ensure that the future generations and that the world in general stays below that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold? Yeah, and the DoD just burns about 10.3 billion gallons of oil every single day. And just on our tiny island of Guam, they own about 30% of the land, and they are in the process of building a live firing range complex above one of the most sacred spaces, the area of Retidian on Guam, in a plateau village called Tailalo. This is right near where the new Marine base was constructed, which also resulted in over 1,000 acres of pristine limestone forests and the complete leveling and destruction of an ancestral site known as Magwak village. And it's so sad that our local forces haven't had the ability and the regulatory agencies haven't had the real staff to ensure that our lands and our sacred sites are protected. And they also have access issues onto the military bases. So this sort of desecration is something that we're used to in the Marianas, but it's definitely something that is in violation of our human rights. And especially given that none of these military expansion activities have any informed, free, or prior consent for the Chamorro people or the natives living here, given that our political status on Guam is that of a U.S. territory, and we have really no say over the use of our waters, our lands, or any of our resources. Most of the legislators here on Guam, as well as the governor, wrote a letter to the U.S. to stop construction of this base and the destruction of our ancestral sites. The admiral at the time just said, "Oh no, sorry, we have deadlines to stick to." And so there's an obvious degradation that's happening, and there's an obvious discontent from the locals, as well as just a lack of care and compassion for our plight here and for our ancestral sites here on the part of the military. So the U.S. is slowly encroaching their military might into the other islands, even into the islands specifically in the Northern Marianas of Pagan, Fernando Mendoneza, and Tinian. The MIT, which is one of the different projects happening, and there's 5 happening by the U.S. military right now. The MIT calls for using over 1 million square miles of ocean and air in trainings, and there's the MERC, and there's other just different examples of expanding the military's testing and training throughout most of Micronesia to create the largest training and testing ranges in the world. And again, this is in pristine habitat. These are in areas that is hard to get to for our own people, and we've been wanting to resettle these areas. This is the volcanic island of Pagan, and there's so much actions that are happening that we don't even really know about in real time. And it's really unfortunate that the people on the ground and the people who live here don't have a say over these resources, and that people in Washington or in the Pentagon, thousands of miles away, who don't have any connections to these lands, are the ones who have more say over the fate of our islands. And so some of the long and short-term support that the Chamorro people need from the Marianas, from this body and others, is one is to possibly take the U.S. off the UN Security Council. That's one place that we can definitely see a shift in the way that the world moves in regards to military and in regards to human rights as well. Put pressure on the U.S. to decarbonize, demilitarize, and decolonize the Pacific and beyond. There's so much harm that has happened because of militarization, because of colonization, and because of the increased carbon that has been released into the world because of those actions. Supporting a just transition for all communities impacted by U.S. militarization and by the fossil fuel industry is a really beautiful way that we can all be moving forward with a place-based, vision-led way of doing things. Specifically to Guam, supporting all the efforts for Chamorro self-determination and ensuring that there's free, prior, and informed consent by the Indigenous people when it comes to their lands and waters and military action. So I really thank you. And I really want to thank all the panelists here who've taught me so much, who I resonated so deeply with all the knowledge that they shared. And I'm really hoping to see a more peaceful, more prosperous Pacific.
This concludes today's panel discussion. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing your expertise and your knowledge about your home island nation, and especially about the impact of U.S. militarism in your island nation. Thank you so much to the UN Human Rights Council for allowing us to speak today. Thank you to Encomendios for accrediting this event, as well as to co-sponsors, the Kearney Foundation and the Peace For Okinawa Coalition. We would also like to thank OCW 670 and the Ryukyu Independence Action Network for your support. And thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in today. If you have any questions or would like to get a hold of any of our speakers, please do not hesitate to contact us at contact@peaceforokinawa.org, and we would be happy to get you in touch. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.
Aloha.
Thank you. Aloha. Mahalo.